The talk we're going to see today is the result of a really long kind of discussion and a focus on Blackland Prairie that our group, our division, and a lot of the folks in our section have been kind of engaged in at least 5 years or longer. It's a really important part. It's the eastern half of the Austin jurisdiction. And if you know that, it brings back fond memories. Renee Barrera, who is a colleague of ours who works for the park department for years, was very interested and focused on kind of bringing attention to the Blackland Prairie. He died several years ago, and really this topic would be near and dear to his heart. And I'd like us all to be thinking of him as we hear the value and its sensitivities and special nature of the Blackland Prairie. The environmental scientist, Ana Gonzalez, and engineer Lindsay Olind are here to discuss the unique characters of the Blackland Prairie ecoregion streams and channels and floodplains and their specific history and vulnerabilities. They're going to present the findings from a study that we have, and I'm going to put a link in the chat for the publication that we did together. Lindsay led that effort, but it was literally 5 years in the making, and a lot of other people were involved in it. I think it's a groundbreaking and a really important work, and this is an overview of that. But as you'll see, it also incorporates a lot of other things that we've been learning and thinking about the Blackland Prairie over that entire period. Let's go ahead and get it started. Lindsay Olind.
All right. Thanks, Mateo. I am really excited to talk with the department and people about the Blackland Prairie. One of the reasons is because it was a shift in my own professional, personal understanding of the Blackland Prairie. And I could have told this talk and this storyline in lots of different ways, where for me, it was a lot of plot twists, red herrings, mysterious turns. And instead of going through that kind of drama, I'm going to tell it kind of linearly, where we start and go through the full history of the Blackland Prairie, what we know from kind of current time, but we're going to start even farther away from that. And I was going to make sure we talk about this work involved a lot of people. So we had a lot of people served on our 50 sites of field visit. So thank you to all of you that went out. And I also got a lot of help from Aaron Richter and Dads when he was going through the stats here, and Anna and Mateo. So many thanks to those folks, and for all the people who take pictures and put them on the G Drive. I tried to switch this format to where it's mostly pictures, and aside from all of the Texas history centers that I went through, I also use the G Drive. So, and as much as pictures on the G Drive, lots to find. Thank you. We'll start off with the who, where, what, when, why. Where is the Blackland Prairie? It's a ecoregion in Texas that actually goes all the way up through Canada. For us in Austin, it starts kind of right at the fault line, right around Mopac, and it transitions into the Blackland Prairie. So west of Mopac, we have the Edwards Plateau, and then east, we start getting into the Blackland Prairie. By 1:30, we are well into the Blackland Prairie, so kind of eastern Travis County, about the size of Kentucky in Texas. What is the Blackland Prairie? It is very different than what we think of in the Edwards Plateau stream. So those west side streams, we think Barton Springs. We have the large boulders. We have steeper streams, a lot of exposed bedrock. In the Blackland Prairie, we have flatter streams, finer sediment. We do have cobbles, but they're not. You don't see those kind of rolling cascades that you sometimes see out west, and we rarely have bedrock. It's a depositional system. This is a great image that I love from Texas Parks and Wildlife, where it is a poster for the Blackland Prairie showing different species. And then this is an image from the field showing that this thick layer of clay, and this is some of the really fertile soil that the Blackland Prairie is named after. Why do we as a city care about the Blackland Prairie? Why does our department care about the Blackland Prairie? Well, we have an extensive amount of drainage assets, i.e. creeks, that are carrying our water through the Blackland Prairie. So we have about 800 miles that are in the Blackland Prairie that either are in our jurisdiction or flow into our jurisdiction. So that those unique characteristics impact how we're carrying water. And then we also have this mandate. We as a department need to have our rules, regulations, designs keep up so that we know that the designs are going to be working across the city. So our well known for having science-informed management, engineering, science-informed engineering. And then this third component is equity. We know that there is development pushing east, has been going on for building over the past 10 years. And status of the creeks out east, those are the systems that are going to be inherited by these communities where the east side, the development on the east is also tending to be considered more affordable housing. So that inheritance of the streams and their conditions is really important for us to be thinking about. I'm combining the when and the how on the Blackland Prairie, and I'm going a little bit beyond the 100-year engineering timeframe. And I'm going to be talking initially, because this is so important in the piece that I didn't know well, this is the thousands of years before Anglo settlers came. So we had indigenous people on this land, very, in general, minimal disturbance compared to what we have right now. Different tribes were in Austin, overlapping, traveling through Austin, not a sediment or a large settlement like they have kind of in some more southeast states. But we've lost a lot of that history. And so what we have to find out about what was it before Anglo settlers really started expanding in our area are descriptions of what the settlers were describing right when they came. In the early 1800s, I'm going to read this out loud because I think it's really important to imagine, because it's very different than how I had perceived this area. So this person, Jim Brooke, near Manor, said, "I can sit on the porch before my door and can see miles of the most beautiful prairie, interwoven with groves of timber, surpassing in my idea the beauties of the sea." Another example, we have a lot of settlers who are coming in kind of from Tennessee, Kentucky area, and what they were writing home during this period of U.S. manifest destiny going west, writing home and describing what the land looked like. And often they were talking about prairie, grassland with these groves of timber going through the creeks. So timber and forest along the creeks was a normal thing during this time period. The second thing that was interesting for me is that the historic records show that the creeks out in the Blackland Prairie were stable and ran clear. Early settlers often wrote home about the clear streams and springs in the Blackland Prairie. Those clear waters that you have when you're in a fine sediment system have to be coming from a stable watershed without a lot of sediment and erosion. And that was largely due to really dense prairie systems. So when you have these dense grasslands, those are able to keep those grasslands can really hold down these small particles onto the watershed, so they're not being washed away. And then the trees, the roots on the trees, provided a kind of a hard point instead of the bedrock. So we have tree roots going across the stream. And if you're going out in Austin and you're walking the streams in the east, you might start to notice them if there actually are trees. You might start to see these tree roots actually stabilizing not just the bank, but actually through the stream bed to the other side. And the presence of the trees also allowed, when they would die, they would fall in and create these debris jams. So another set of hard points in lacking the bedrock. Now we have another set of hard points. So tree roots, these debris jams, and then they're also getting looped in with the beaver colonies that were used to be widespread across the U.S. So we'd also have beaver dams and another hard point in these systems. And that's why together these East Creeks actually were stable and ran clear. It's another image I just always enjoy, the root system of different prairie plants. And you can see how this is like 5 feet down, up to 15 feet down. So these plants really were strong, kind of knitted and holding down those fine particles. I want us to keep thinking about that as we go forward. And then the runoff to the volumes to the creeks were significantly lower. So that's another reason why we were having not a whole lot of erosion, because these prairie grasslands were essentially like sponges, soaking up a lot of the rain. And they also had, because of the soil, they had these micro depressions called gilgae, and those would form a couple feet to up to 20 feet depressions. And A&M has done research where at some of these remnant prairie sites where they found that it can hold 1-inch storms completely with no runoff. So these micro depressions and the infiltration are holding back the water really helped reduce the volumes in this ecoregion. It's about 6 gallons they're estimating. So now we are going, I'm putting a timeline kind of at the bottom. We're getting into settlers have arrived in the 1820s and now are getting pretty established, going through Manor. Settlers, when they first came, weren't doing ag the way we might think of it with crops and row crops. It was really cattle because the Blackland Prairie soils were so hard to get through. They didn't have equipment made. So it was mostly cattle, a lot of open grazing. After the Civil War, more ranchers from the South, more agriculture came into this area. And then a lot of things started kind of booming after the 1870s. The steel plow was invented across the US. You have these sod busters, but there was also a steel plow that was specifically invented for Blackland Prairie soil, which was especially hard to get through. We also had the railroad come through, starting at Manor. So now we had a way to have that supply and demand connection. We could actually start bringing out what we were growing. So that was a huge boom in the ag business around here. And then 1870s also started introducing barbed wire. So now these cattle that were grazing the Blackland Prairie that were unconfined were now starting to get into these really small overgrazing conditions. And this all is leading towards this rise and reign of King Cotton. And this is something that I've heard of the phrase King Cotton before, and I didn't understand the full extent for Austin specifically. And so the rise and reign of King Cotton is a major player in what our conditions are right now. Here's an example from 1840s where we have the most settled area is in center of town, and then by 1890, you can see how all of these farms and ranches started really establishing and blocking off land. Because of the Blackland Prairie soils, this area was so successful in cotton production that it was one of the largest in the world. This is the time that really shifts from the idea and where I kind of connect with what I think of as Austin history, where it's this cotton economy of the Old South meets the cattle economy of the Old West. And this is 1900. What I didn't understand until I started looking at these historic images was, yes, I knew King Cotton was a big deal. Yes, I knew that the ag wasn't extensive, but the benefit, the reason it was especially extensive in Austin's Blackland Prairie is that you could clear from roadway all the way to the stream bank. So it really was full change of land use. And that aspect is really important to be thinking of. Just as an example, to show how extreme that was, by the 1900s, when the federal wildlife surveys were going through across the US, but in Texas, already most of Blackland Prairie was cultivated, and there was so little natural wildlife left that they barely even stopped to do much of the surveying. In the 40s, after World War II, there was a lot more of the mechanical, industrial, diesel. So any of the little areas of prairie that farmers and ranchers might have kept for haying, they actually were able to now plow even more, so that we lost a lot more of that Blackland Prairie area. And over time, there have been different shifts because of the economy. There's now less cotton and more road crops. It became more corporate and less of these small farms. And then there is more grazing and haying. In the 1990s, in the Blackland Prairie around Austin, the farms started getting divided and being sold as subdivisions. With the barbed wire and more grazing, I like seeing this picture as another route example where this is an example where you're increasing grazing. And as you can see, as you're going into being conditions that are overgrazed, you start to really lose that root mass that can help keep the soil down, keep a healthy cover that can actually infiltrate water. And this is a time where I like to discuss something because it was what I needed to help understand what the data showed. And so I wanted to mention this language here. It's called shifting baseline syndrome. It came from the kind of 1990s during some understanding ecology. And it's basically just a description of collective memory. How do we forget what something was like 2 generations ago, 3 generations ago? So it's these kind of gradual changes. And the the example that this kind of thought came from was in the Keys and fishing. So a prize fish in the 1950s was really big. And then in the 1960s, you'd see people excited about coming back with commercial fishing ships. And then over time, you're seeing these fishes get smaller. They're kind of the fish that people are excited about. In that moment, that you can't see the different changes and the shifting baseline, but if you are able to kind of zoom out, you can. The thoughts on why shifting baseline happens is that there's either a lack of data on the natural environment, so loss of interaction with the natural environment, and just similarly a loss of familiarity. And this is what was helpful for me in understanding why I needed to go back into the history before our 1940 aerials to understand what the data was showing, what we know about ecology, and then what I thought I knew about the local history. Starting in the 70s, watershed, or previous iteration of watershed, we understood that we were having erosion problems, we were having flooding problems. This is where in the 1970s, where we start putting in regulations. And our regulations at the time were really progressive across the US. So first big one was 1974. I know Matt Holland is coming in, so I'm not going to go through all of them, and he'll talk about some of the incremental progress on these regulations, and sometimes it's big jumps of progress in the regulations. That 2013 was one of those big jumps in progress for the regulations, understanding that we had really erodible soil in the suburban watersheds, which was kind of covering which is mostly the Blackland Prairie. And so as a way to improve how we were protecting our water quality and reduce erosion, the idea was we would put a buffer around these Blackland Prairie streams at smaller drainages, so up to 64 acres. So now we're going to protect these, and that should help prevent a lot of our problems. And that was a huge gain. From that, we were able to increase our protection by 92% in the Blackland Prairie. All these regulations that we've had so far have really focused on data from central Austin and West Austin. A lot of it is driven by where people started living, and then also the endangered salamanders and Barton Springs connections and Edwards Aquifer. This is a map. A lot of the data is pretty similar in terms of spatial scale, but here's a riparian vegetation map where we had a lot of data, again, in the center of Austin and west. But we know that development's expanding farther into the east. And so the question that we were still posed with in 2016 was, well, if we're protecting all of these buffers in the same way that we are other areas, but we know that there's been a lot more of expansion in the east, are those buffers, how are they doing? What are the actual conditions of those buffers, since we haven't actually had a lot of studies out east? So this is where this kind of put the boots to the ground in 2016, and we collected data, riparian vegetation data, so tree canopy data along the sides of the creek. We looked at the stream conditions, and then also looped in development impervious cover. For us, development impervious cover is a major driver for a lot of our regulations based on urban Austin and West Austin. What I felt like was really important for this work was to keep putting it in reference, whatever we would find, keep referencing it in comparison to our urban Austin and our Western Austin data sets, because that's kind of what so far has been driving a lot of our rules and regulations. We did fieldwork in 2017, and then for several years, we were pulling in different studies, going back out into the field to check on some of our results, bringing in new GIS tools that we could use to understand places that we couldn't get to. It's progressed, where we talked to the Environmental Commission in 2017. We did a blog posting in 2018, and then we have this final report, which might read a little bit like a dissertation, but I ended up putting so many figures in there because there is so little information about the Blackland Prairie in Texas, period, let alone the Blackland Prairie in Texas and in Austin, related to how water quality and stream stability and just watershed concerns. If you are ever interested in a Cliff Notes version of that, I have an email I'd be happy to forward, or a couple references in there. You could skip a couple sections that are super lovely and also very nerdy. So what I'm going to give you guys now is just a check-in on some of my favorite takeaways, many of which were not what I was expecting. First, it's this idea that impervious cover as a proxy or quality of riparian buffers doesn't work in the Blackland Prairie. Not to say that impervious cover isn't going to degrade the Blackland Prairie, it will, but the Blackland Prairie is already at a shift in land use and on those riparian buffers that we've already gotten to a point where it's at a subpar quality to begin with. So here's an image out of Maha where, remembering those settler descriptions, we're normally seeing rows of thick interwoven riparian forests. And then you have Barton Springs in contrast, where there isn't as much clearing. And one of the big reasons is because it was mostly cattle grazing, but it wasn't as confined. And it's kind of hard to clear when you're going into really rocky, steep terrain. So this is why you can imagine how easy it was to clear. And that's still the case in the Blackland Prairie. The second, which is related, is that these buffers were the canopy cover, the quality of the riparian buffers was actually lower in the Blackland Prairie, so worse in the Blackland Prairie than urban Austin, which was surprising to me also, thinking about how this is the idea of urban Austin, whereas I think of East Blackland Prairie as typically like more rural, and I was thinking of it as expecting it to be more, quote, natural and undisturbed, but that's not the case. Got lots of different maps showing this data, but this is one of my favorite, where it's just showing that the lowest to the poorest quality in terms of woody species count was along the riparian areas is in the east compared to central Austin and west Austin. One of the big questions is, why is this? We hoped that with the intention of the WPO in 2013 truly was to create a protection, thinking that the riparian buffers would bounce back if they were degraded. But one of the problems is this Blackland Prairie soil, once it's disturbed, you have to kind of have more of an active restoration process. And another reason is this legacy effect. So we have extremely low seed sources in catchment. So if we want there to be a tree growing in a riparian zone, we need a seed to create a sapling and then to a tree. So this image on this graph is just showing that along the creek and across the drainage areas, thinking about this as seed source, the canopy cover is the lowest in the Blackland Prairie compared to urban Austin and then Edwards Plateau. The third piece is that I showed some images here of hard points that we did find, but this was pretty rare, these hard points. Overall, one of the few grade controls we saw was a wastewater line, which was one of the first times I was excited about seeing a wastewater line going through a creek, because it was holding about 3 feet of grade. But generally, there was no grade control. So again, the pre-settler descriptions of the dominant trees with the beavers together, those created these natural hard points. But now we've lost those natural hard points across the Blackland Prairie with the loss of the riparian trees and the loss of beavers. This is a problem because in these fine systems, if you lose a hard point, the stability will completely unravel until your next hard point. So that can create these things called head cuts, which is something that erosion has spent a lot of money trying to repair. It's much easier if you have a grade control, keep it there than to lose it and then have to repair it. But I like this image because it's showing fine soil with very little cohesion becoming unstable with the loss of that head cut in this video. And then this is an example, these pretty drastic incised sort of nightmare scenarios in sized creeks where you get this down cutting, like this video is showing, where this incision. So these are kind of the symptoms or the leftover signals that you might see because of the incision in the Blackland Prairie since we've lost those hard points. These are ones with trees, but at a certain point, if you're having so much incision downstream, the issue with head cuts is they will keep migrating upstream. So if you're in a stream with a head cut and it's becoming so high, it can actually go under the roots. This was an area where this was just a very small strip of forest, wise, pretty clear cut area. That sediment from the head cuts, from the incision, from the instability has to go somewhere. So the early settlers, again, describe those streams as running clear, but we have, in our current scenario, we have a loss of grasslands, we have those higher flows, and we have these unstable streams. We've lost that resistance, that strength. This plays out when I was looking at the EII data over 2017 to 2016. This is TSS, which is kind of our measure of how cloudy, how turbid is the water. So Edwards Plateau probably rings pretty true, pretty low. When we go out on hikes, you might notice the clear water. Urban, Austin, this is all base flow, so not when there's a big storm. But Blackland Prairie, we have this big pulse of TSS with no wastewater effluent. So we have several wastewater permitted sites in the Blackland Prairie. And then when you look at the sites that have wastewater discharges, even more TSS. So all the sites that we visited were turbid, even though it wasn't raining. And I want to contrast that again with what the settlers were describing in this spongy grassland wooded ecosystem compared to what we have right now. It's really important to say that it wasn't totally nuked, so all is not lost. It was rare, but we do still have high quality conditions in the Blackland Prairie. We even have beavers. I love when people are sending me images of beavers that they see. This is an example from Liz. Thank you. And we saw biotic grade controls. We have two at-risk scenarios. So one is we have an area where existing development from like the 70s, 80s, 90s in the Blackland Prairie is at risk now because unique conditions that are in the Blackland Prairie. And then we have areas that don't have any development that have low quality riparian buffers, but they can't resist these adjustments that are expected to occur when we have future development. So basics to relay before I hand it off to Anna are that the watersheds used to have trees along the creek in the Blackland Prairie. The riparian trees were critical in having stream stability out in the Blackland Prairie, and that we used to have clear flow in the Blackland Prairie. Watershed cares about this because extensive part of our drainage assets, the riparian conditions have gotten worse over time, and this is making the stream super vulnerable because of this unique environmental sensitivity, and our regulations right now aren't reflecting that unique vulnerability. So now I'm going to kick it off to Anna.
All right. So part of this effort to document the findings was also to have actionable recommendations so we can translate what we learn into things that we feel are going to make a difference. And one of those is provisions in our critical water quality zone that include restoration. Like right now, we only leave the area protected from development, but we need to do something more actively since these areas are not recovering on their own as the expectations we had based on our assumptions from the hill country knowledge. One thing that is going to be really, really important is in our rain to river effort of the strategic planning, we have a unique opportunity to revise a lot of this. So our findings in this report are going to get inserted into some of the information that is going to be critical to developing a new strategic plan that understands more clearly and pushes for appropriate protections and actions for our creeks both ways, both sites, both ecoregions. In addition to that, one of the things that the rain to river is going to do is what do we value? Re-examine what do we value in our department in terms of protections. So right now we do protect infrastructure as the highest priority, and natural components are less and less and less value. We need to revise some of that to understand that some of these natural components are infrastructure components in the natural system that maintain function. So that's one thing that we need to examine and reprioritize the value that they bring for the function of our creeks and our watersheds. Because one of the findings was that we just letting it alone and letting it be is not going to do the work to recover them, we need to do active restoration, and Lindsay mentioned. So we have a conversation with tree folks and proposed, would you do a floodplain reforestation program? They ran with it. They applied for funding because we were taking forever to provide the funding, and our processes are slow as a large organization. And right now they have a program that reforests private and public parcels in the Blackland Prairie. So those are some of the actionable things that it was a recommendation and we're already moving forward with. And in terms of land protection, we have protected a lot in the western watersheds. one of our recommendations is let's do an equivalent effort with its own particular goals and strategies and prioritization in the Blackland Prairie. There's a lot of interconnectedness in the findings and recommendations with additional other efforts in the city, including from the Imagine Austin plan all the way to more recent plans. So there's a lot of synergy there. And I know Lindsay doesn't like that word, so I'm sorry for forgetting to say that. One of those examples is the gaps and strengths assessment of our green infrastructure that found that, we have been protecting more of the hill country. And one of the recommendations of that report is that we do a similar effort in the eastern watersheds. There is a lot of attention being placed. Thomas mentioned in the chat that the City Council just passed a resolution to address some of these inequities and provide the adequate protections in the Blackland Prairie. Chris emphasizes that the press is paying attention, and there's a lot of support in the environmental community, particularly those that are looking at environmental justice. So we kind of undo and mitigate some of the harms that historically have been done to the eastern watersheds because we have a misallocated sense of what the priorities want, focusing only on one area of our cities. I wanted to highlight there is a upcoming talk, as Matteo mentioned. Matt Holland will be talking about the history of our watershed ordinances, and Matt's dad had a very fun connection. He lived in the Blackland Prairie, grew up there. So this is very personal and connected to Matt. So I hope everybody can make to that one presentation, and we will hear back from him. He's such a great, fun presenter and amazing. I just wanted to leave you with what our water quality program mission and vision as a reflection piece here. Thank you, everybody.